The night my name stopped belonging to me, I didn't lose it in a courtroom or on a hospital form. I gave it away in a parking lot that smelled like wet asphalt and cheap coffee. I remember thinking it would be temporary. I remember promising myself I'd come back for it the way people promise they'll come back for a childhood home they're selling for now. But the truth is, I had been rehearsing disappearance for years. It starts like most betrayals do, quietly, with good intentions. With a mind that can justify anything as long as the story sounds noble when you whisper it in the dark. I used to be the kind of person who corrected people gently when they got my surname wrong. I used to sign my emails with a neat, consistent flourish, like identity was something you could stabilize by repeating it. Back then, I believed in clean lines, honest work, honest love, honest sleep. Then I met the version of myself who could live without air. It happened in the most ordinary place, an office that pretended to care about people. I worked in compliance for a mid-size company that handled sensitive client data. Not glamorous. Not evil in the way movies like. Just an endless river of forms and meetings and best practices, all of it wrapped in that sterile optimism companies use to hide the fact that they're always starving for profit. I was good at my job because I was afraid. Afraid of mistakes, afraid of conflict, afraid of being ordinary. The fear made me meticulous. It made me dependable. It made me the kind of person managers trust with quiet problems. And quiet problems are the ones that rot. When I found the first irregularity, it looked like a typo. A duplicated file name. A strange timestamp. Something that could be explained away if you didn't look too long. So I looked too long. I stayed late. I compared logs. I followed the trail like it was a puzzle, because a puzzle is safer than what it really was, evidence. Someone was selling access. Not the dramatic kind, no masked hacker in a hoodie. It was internal, slow, methodical. A drip system. Small enough to avoid panic, consistent enough to fund a second life. I reported it the way they train you to report things, calmly, internally, through the right channels, with the faith of a person who thinks systems exist to protect the good. My manager thanked me with a smile so thin it barely cast a shadow. 2 days later, the person who trained me, my colleague Mara, didn't show up to work. She wasn't a close friend. We didn't share secrets or cry together in bathrooms. But she was the first person who made that office feel human. She brought oranges in winter. She left small notes on people's desks when they did something well. She spoke to interns like they mattered. She also had access. When security interviewed me, they were polite in the way predators can be polite when they're deciding where to bite first. What made you look, they asked. Did anyone encourage you, they asked. Are you absolutely sure it wasn't Mara, they asked. I said I didn't know. I said I only saw what I saw. I said her name like it was a person, not a possibility. A week later, they found Mara's car near the river. The official story was tidy, stress, debt, a private breakdown. People in the office spoke about her with a reverent sadness that required nothing from them except a few heavy sighs and a bouquet. The real story wasn't official, and it wasn't tidy. Because the day they found her car, my manager called me into a conference room and closed the blinds. He didn't sit. He stood behind my chair, hands resting on the back like he owned both the furniture and the spine inside me. We appreciate your diligence, he said, and his voice had that slow patience adults use when talking to a child who doesn't understand consequences. But diligence can be misunderstood. My throat tightened. I tried to swallow and felt the swallow get stuck halfway down, like my body was refusing to cooperate with my denial. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were printouts, my late-night access logs, my private messages, my personal email address, a screenshot of a bank transfer ID made to my mother months before. A complete sketch of my life. Not to blackmail me yet, but to demonstrate that my life was not a private thing. You've been under a lot of pressure, he said. And when people are under pressure, sometimes they make mistakes. Sometimes they misinterpret data. Sometimes they accuse the wrong person. I stared at the folder, and suddenly I understood what compliance really meant. It didn't mean ethics. It meant obedience. It meant you existed to keep the machine legal, not clean. What happened to Mara? I asked, and I hated how small my voice sounded. My manager smiled, like I'd asked a question that proved his point. Mara made choices, he said. And you need to make yours. That was the first time I felt the world tilt. Not dramatically, not with a crash, just a subtle shift where gravity stopped being reliable. For 2 days, I walked around with the folder's weight still pressing into my palms even when my hands were empty. I tried to convince myself it was a scare tactic. I tried to convince myself adults didn't do what my mind was implying they could do. Then I got a call from an unknown number. A woman's voice. Low. Controlled. The kind of voice that doesn't waste syllables on comfort. You reported an irregularity, she said. I'm calling to confirm you've understood the situation. I don't know who you are, I said. That's correct, she replied. You don't. My mouth went dry. You have 2 options, she continued. You can keep talking. Or you can stop. If you keep talking, you'll lose more than your job. If you stop, you'll be allowed to continue living the life you already have. Quietly. Aloud, I repeated, because that word was a knife. There was a pause. Then, very softly, Mara didn't stop. The call ended. That night I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets like I was a child hiding from a thunderstorm. I stared at the lines between the tiles and tried to remember the last time I felt safe without having to manufacture it. I wanted to go to the police. The thought rose up like a flare, bright, righteous, simple. But the folder they showed me was the point. They knew everything. They had access. They could make any story about me as tidy as the story they made about Mara. And even worse than fear was the shame of understanding how easily I could be steered. I didn't sleep. I watched the sun rise like it was something I'd never earned. At work, people avoided my eyes. Maybe they knew. Maybe they sensed the smell of danger on me. Or maybe I was just projecting guilt onto ordinary politeness. Either way, I started to feel like a ghost with a badge. Then the second folder appeared. This time, it wasn't handed to me in a conference room. It arrived at my apartment door in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside were 2 things, a photograph of my mother walking out of her building, and a note. You have 1 week to choose a life. I stared at that note until the words stopped looking like language and started looking like a bruise. I don't know what you imagine you'd do in that situation. Maybe you think you'd fight. Maybe you think you'd become brave. Maybe you think you'd do the right thing because you're the kind of person who believes the right thing is always available. I used to think that, too. But when someone holds the people you love inside their fist, morality becomes abstract. It becomes something you can admire from a distance while you do something uglier up close. I called my mother that evening. I tried to sound normal. I asked about her health. I asked if the elevator in her building was still broken. I laughed at a joke that wasn't funny. Then I heard her breathe, that familiar, ordinary breath, and my vision blurred with panic so sudden it felt like pain. Is everything okay? She asked. Yes, I lied. I'm just tired. I didn't tell her that I was about to erase myself to keep her safe. I didn't tell her I was about to make a choice that would destroy the person she thought she raised. Because part of me needed her to keep believing I was still a good son. A good child. A good human being. And if she knew what I was about to do, that illusion would die too. Over the next few days, I did something I'd never done before. I started preparing for a life that wasn't mine. I withdrew cash in small amounts so it wouldn't trigger alerts. I bought a cheap phone and never turned it on inside my apartment. I wrote down addresses of motels near the highway. I packed a bag and repacked it, like rearranging socks could rearrange fate. I also went to Mara's memorial. The company organized it in a rented hall with 2 bright lights and 2 sweet pastries. People stood around with paper cups of coffee, talking softly as if softness could reverse death. There was a framed photo of Mara on a table, the kind of photo where someone is smiling naturally because they trust the camera. It felt obscene to look at it. I stood in front of it and tried to pray, even though I didn't know who I was praying to. My chest hurt in that slow way grief hurts when it isn't allowed to become loud. That's when I noticed someone watching me from the back of the room. A man I'd never seen before. Ordinary clothes. Ordinary face. But his attention was sharp, anchored on me like a hook. When I left the hall, he followed. Not close enough to be obvious. Close enough to make sure I knew. I walked faster. He matched my pace. I ducked into a crowded cafe. He waited outside. I felt my sanity thin, like fabric worn down by the same friction every day. I realized this wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was supervision. That night, I made my decision. Not because it was brave. Because it was the only choice that didn't involve my mother becoming a photograph in someone else's folder. I sent an email to my manager with a subject line that made my stomach twist, clarification. In it, I wrote that I had rechecked the logs and believed my earlier report could have been a misinterpretation. I wrote that I regretted the confusion. I wrote that I was willing to cooperate with an internal correction. My fingers shook as I typed. I hated myself with every sentence. When I hit send, I felt something snap inside me quietly, like a thin bone breaking under steady pressure. 30 minutes later, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number, good. Wait for instructions. I sat on my bed and stared at my packed bag. I wondered if this was what surrender felt like. Not dramatic. Just, exhausted. The instructions came 2 days later. A time. A location. A simple directive, come alone. It was a rest stop off the highway, the kind of place people pass through without leaving a memory. When I arrived, the sky was low and heavy, and the parking lot glistened from recent rain. I sat in my car with my hands on the steering wheel, breathing slowly, counting each breath like it was a rope I could hold onto. A man knocked on my window. Not the one from the memorial. This one was older, with tired eyes and a face that looked like it had learned to be kind only when kindness served a purpose. I rolled the window down just enough to hear him. You're late, he said, though I wasn't. I came, I replied, and I hated how that word sounded like obedience. He glanced around, then leaned closer. You want your mother safe? He asked. My throat closed. I nodded. He slid an envelope through the small gap in the window. Then you'll do exactly what it says. I took it with hands that didn't feel like mine. What is this? I asked. A life, he said. Not yours. But it'll keep you breathing. I opened the envelope. Inside was an ID, a name I'd never seen before. A date of birth that wasn't mine. A small stack of cash. And a single sheet of paper with one sentence printed in clean black letters, you are going to disappear before you can change your mind. I looked up at him, the rain's cold smell filling my lungs, and I finally understood what this was. It wasn't protection. It was exile. And the worst part, the part that still makes my stomach turn when I remember it, is that I felt relief. Because relief is what happens when fear finally tells you what to do. He tapped the envelope with one finger. There's a phone number inside. You call it when you're ready to stop being who you are. And if I'm not ready, I whispered. His eyes softened, almost sympathetically. You'll be ready, he said. Because you're already out of choices. He walked away into the wet, anonymous night, leaving me in my car with a new name pressing into my palm like a coin you can never spend. I sat there for a long time, staring at the ID, feeling my old life shrink behind my ribs. I thought of Mara's smile in that framed photo. I thought of my mother's voice on the phone. I thought of my own cowardice dressed up as sacrifice. Then I did the thing that changed everything. I took my real wallet out. I looked at my driver's license, the face that still believed it belonged somewhere. I held it over the trash bin outside my car. And I hesitated. Because part of me still wanted to be saved without paying the price. But no one was coming. So I dropped my old name into the bin, like it was something disposable, and I watched it land on top of fast food wrappers and receipts from strangers. In that moment, I didn't feel like I was starting over. I felt like I was committing a slow, careful murder. I didn't call the number right away. I drove for hours with the envelope on the passenger seat like it might explode if I touched it again. Highway signs blurred into meaningless arrows. Cities became clusters of light without names. Somewhere between exits, the idea of home lost its edges. When I finally stopped, it was at a motel that looked like it had been built to be forgotten. Peeling paint. A flickering sign missing 2 letters. The kind of place where nobody asks questions because nobody wants answers. I paid cash. I didn't give my real name. I didn't give the new one either. I just slid the bills across the counter and waited for the key like a verdict. The room smelled like disinfectant and old smoke. I sat on the edge of the bed, envelope still unopened in my lap, and realized something that made my chest tighten. This was the first place where nothing expected me to be myself. That freedom felt wrong. I finally took out the phone from the envelope. Cheap plastic. No contacts except one number saved as a single letter. I stared at it until my hands stopped shaking enough to dial. It rang twice. "You're late," a voice said. Not the man from the rest stop. Younger. Sharper. "I needed time," I replied. A pause. Then, "You don't get time anymore. You get instructions." "I want to know what happens next," I said. "You already know," the voice answered. "You stop existing." I closed my eyes. "And my mother?" "She's fine," the voice said instantly. Too instantly. "She will remain fine as long as you follow the rules." Rules. The word landed like a chain. "What are the rules?" I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. "You don't contact anyone from your previous life. You don't use your old name, not even in your head. You don't return to familiar places. You don't investigate. You don't confess. You don't try to be a hero." "And if I do?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "You won't," the voice said calmly. "Because you're not stupid." The call ended. I sat there in the silence, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, and realized how quickly obedience can masquerade as clarity. When someone else decides for you, the chaos inside goes quiet. The next morning, I woke up disoriented, reaching for a phone that wasn't mine, for a name that no longer fit. For a moment, just a moment, I forgot what I'd done. Then memory rushed back like cold water. I opened the envelope again. The name on the ID felt foreign in my mouth when I tried to say it out loud. It belonged to someone who had lived quietly, left few traces, someone ordinary enough to be invisible. Perfect. I practiced the signature on hotel stationery until my wrist ached. Each repetition felt like an act of betrayal, not just of who I was, but of who I might have been if I'd chosen differently. By noon, another message came through on the burner phone with coordinates and a time. No greeting. No explanation. I drove. The place was a self-storage facility on the outskirts of a town I'd never heard of. Rows of metal doors. Cameras mounted like unblinking eyes. A woman met me there. She was in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, with hair pulled back tight and clothes that looked intentionally unremarkable. She smiled like someone trained to smile without warmth. "You made it," she said, checking her watch. "Good. That tells me you're serious." "About what?" I asked. "About staying alive," she replied. She unlocked one of the units and gestured for me to step inside. It was larger than I expected. Inside were boxes labeled with dates, folders, and a duffel bag. "This is your bridge," she said. "Documents, cash, clothing. Enough to get you established. You'll move cities twice in the next year. Different jobs. Different faces." "Faces," I echoed. She smiled thinly. "Haircuts. Glasses. Weight loss. Weight gain. You'd be amazed what passes for a different person." "And after that?" I asked. She looked at me carefully. "After that, you'll be boring." Boring. The word sounded like salvation. She handed me a folder. Inside were step-by-step instructions for the next 3 months, where to work, where to live, which routes to take, which habits to avoid. "This feels like prison," I said. "It's not," she replied. "Prison has bars. This has options." "What kind of options?" She leaned closer. "The kind that disappear if you don't behave." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the folder in half and throw it at her feet. Instead, I nodded. Because nodding was easier than dying. Over the next weeks, I became an expert in forgetting. I deleted numbers from my memory the way you delete files from a hard drive, methodically, with forced precision. I stopped thinking in terms of past and future and focused on tasks: show up, do the job, don't stand out. I worked in places designed for anonymity. Warehouses. Temporary offices. Night shifts where faces blur and conversations never go deep enough to hurt. People ask me questions sometimes. Innocent ones. "Where are you from?" I learned to answer without hesitation. Hesitation invites curiosity. "What do you do?" "I do this," I said, and kept my voice neutral. "Family." I shrugged. "Not really." That one was the hardest. Each time I said it, something inside me twisted. Because my mother was still alive. Still breathing. Still thinking I existed. I just wasn't allowed to be her child anymore. At night, in whatever rented room I was assigned that month, I dreamed in fragments. Faces without names. Places without geography. Sometimes I dreamed I was standing in front of a mirror and my reflection lagged behind me, moving a second too late, like it didn't recognize me anymore. I stopped sleeping well. Then I stopped sleeping at all. Insomnia peels layers off you. It removes the parts of you that pretend everything is fine. It leaves you raw, honest, and tired enough to believe terrible ideas. That's when the thoughts started. What if I could fix this? What if I could go to the press anonymously? What if I could leak the evidence without attaching my name? What if I could save other Maras? The ideas came with a familiar warmth: righteousness, purpose, the dangerous belief that suffering earns you the right to meaning. I almost acted on it once. I had access to a terminal at a temp job. Not full access, but enough to see familiar structures, familiar vulnerabilities. The machine was bigger than I'd thought and sloppier. I sat there late one night, fingers hovering over the keyboard, heart pounding with the thrill of almost doing something brave. Then my burner phone vibrated. A photo appeared on the screen. My mother. Standing in line at a pharmacy. Unaware. Alive. Under it, a message: Don T. I stared at the image until my eyes burned. That was the moment I understood the true shape of my cage. It wasn't built around me. It was built around the people I loved. After that, something in me collapsed. I didn't feel fear anymore. I felt emptiness. Weeks turned into months. Months into a year, I watched seasons change through windows that were never mine. I celebrated birthdays alone. I marked time by job contracts and prepaid rent. Sometimes, I caught myself answering to my old name in my head. Each time, guilt followed, sharp and immediate, like I'd violated a sacred rule. I became careful with my thoughts. That's what they don't tell you about disappearing. You don't just lose your identity. You police your own mind to keep it from betraying you. One evening, in a small apartment overlooking a parking lot, I turned on the TV for background noise and heard a familiar phrase spoken by a politician during an interview. Internal review found no evidence of wrongdoing. I laughed. The sound surprised me. It came out cracked and wrong, like a noise from a throat that wasn't used anymore. That laugh turned into something else, something close to hysteria. I slid down the wall and sat on the floor, shaking, overwhelmed by the absurdity of it all. Mara was dead. I was erased. And the world had moved on, clean and confident in its lies. That night, I broke a rule. I turned on the burner phone and dialed a number I knew by heart, even though I wasn't supposed to remember it. It rang. Once. Twice. Then voicemail. I hung up before it picked up, heart racing, breath shallow. I didn't leave a message. I didn't speak. But the damage was done. An hour later, my phone buzzed. We warned you. I stared at the message, waiting for the next one. Waiting for proof that my mother had paid the price for my weakness. Nothing came. The silence was worse. For days, I lived in a state of suspended terror. Every ring of the phone. Every knock on the door. Every unfamiliar face in the street felt like judgment arriving late. Then, finally, another message. One more mistake and you lose everything. I put the phone down and cried for the first time since the parking lot. Not quietly. Not with dignity. I cried like someone who had run out of places to hide the truth. I wasn't living. I was being stored. And the darkest realization, the one that haunted me most, was this: I had chosen this. Not fully. Not freely. But enough. I had signed my consent in fear. I had let them take my name. And every day I stayed silent, I helped keep their world intact. That was the moral wound that wouldn't close. Not that I'd been threatened. But that I'd complied. The second year of my disappearance didn't feel dramatic. That was the problem. Drama implies movement. Choice. A sense that something is still unfolding. But my life had flattened into routine, and routine is the most effective sedative ever invented. I woke up. I went to work. I spoke when spoken to. I avoided mirrors because they asked questions I wasn't allowed to answer. People around me thought I was quiet. Polite. A little empty, maybe, but harmless. The kind of person you forget 5 minutes after leaving the room. They didn't know how hard I'd worked to become forgettable. At some point, I stopped thinking about escape and started thinking about endurance. I told myself this was maturity. Acceptance. I told myself that survival didn't need to be meaningful to be justified. That was the lie that kept me functional. The crack came from an unexpected place. Her name was Elise. She worked in the same building, different floor. We shared an elevator sometimes. Nothing special. No sparks. Just two people occupying the same vertical silence. One morning, the elevator stalled between floors. Not dramatically. Just a soft jolt and a sudden stillness. We stood there, the air thick with that particular discomfort strangers share when forced into proximity without context. "Looks like we're stuck," she said, smiling nervously. "Seems so," I replied. Minutes passed. Then more. The silence grew heavier. "I hate this part," she said finally. "What part?" I asked. "The pretending," she said. Pretending I'm not terrified of being trapped. Pretending I'm not thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. Something about her honesty loosened something in me. I'm good at pretending, I said before I could stop myself. She looked at me. Really looked. That sounds exhausting, she said. It was such a simple sentence. No accusation. No curiosity. Just recognition. And it hurt more than any threat I'd ever received. The elevator started again a minute later. We exited, exchanged polite goodbyes, and went our separate ways. But something had shifted. Over the next weeks, we talked more. Small conversations. Coffee machine jokes. Complaints about the building's heating system. She didn't pry. That was the dangerous part. She accepted what I gave her, which made me want to give more. One evening, we walked out together and she asked if I wanted to grab a drink. I almost said no. Every rule in my body screamed no. Instead, I said yes. At the bar, under dim lights and low music, she talked about her life with an openness that felt unreal to me. A failed marriage. A job she stayed in because it was fine. A constant sense that she was living 5 centimeters away from herself. And you? She asked gently. I hesitated. The truth pressed against my teeth like something alive. I don't have much of a past, I said finally. She nodded. Sometimes that's intentional. That was the moment I understood what intimacy actually is. Not confession. Permission. Being with Elise didn't fix me. It made me restless. Because for the first time since I disappeared, someone was seeing the outline of who I was pretending not to be. I started sleeping worse again. I started dreaming about my old life, but now Elise was there too, standing beside my mother, looking at me with the same question in her eyes. Who are you? The pressure became unbearable. One night, I did something reckless. I went back. Not all the way. Not to my old city. Just close enough to feel the gravity of it. I stood across the street from my mother's building, heart pounding, hands cold. I watched people come and go. I watched lights turn on and off. I didn't cross the street. I didn't knock. I just stood there, breathing, memorizing the shape of a life I wasn't allowed to touch. My phone vibrated. I didn't need to look to know who it was. You read too close. I typed back before fear could stop me. I just wanted to see. The reply came slower than usual. That's how it starts. I stared at the screen, something breaking open in me. How does it end? I typed. A long pause. Then, it doesn't. That answer settled something. Because if it didn't end, then this wasn't survival. It was a sentence. I walked away from the building with tears running down my face, not because I'd almost been caught but because I finally understood the cost of my silence. Mara hadn't died just because powerful people were cruel. She had died because enough people like me decided that living quietly was safer than telling the truth loudly. And now I was one of them. The next morning, I didn't go to work. I sat at my kitchen table and wrote everything down. Names. Dates. Patterns. Not as evidence. I knew better than to believe evidence alone could save me, but as a confession. I recorded my voice. Calm. Clear. Honest. I didn't send it to the police. I didn't send it to the press. I sent it to Elise. Along with a message, if you never hear from me again, please understand why. Then I turned off the burner phone. For the first time in years, I made a choice without asking permission. I don't know what happened after that. This is where my story becomes uncertain, and uncertainty is the last luxury they couldn't take from me. Maybe they found me. Maybe Elise kept the secret. Maybe the confession reached someone braver than me. Or maybe nothing happened at all. What I do know is this: I stopped being invisible to myself. I stopped pretending that safety and goodness were the same thing. I learned that losing your name doesn't happen all at once. It happens every time you choose comfort over truth, silence over responsibility, survival over integrity. And if you're listening to this, if my voice is reaching you from wherever I ended up, then let this be the only thing I managed to save. You can start over many times in life. But if you don't carry your name with you, your real one, the one built from your choices, you're not starting over. You're just disappearing more slowly. And some disappearances don't leave a body. They leave a world unchanged.